Hello, welcome to the Future of the Research Centre Seminar Series. I'd like to acknowledge that today we're meeting under the traditional lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present, as well as any First Nation people joining us. If you're joining online, please mute your microphones and turn off your cameras. When we get to Q&A, you're welcome to turn them back on. You could also put your question in the chat box and we'll be monitoring that for questions. Now I'd like to hand over to Associate Professor Laura Conlon to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Perrin. It's lovely to be here and to introduce two fantastic speakers, two of our current PhD students who are both very accomplished practitioners and have come back to study with us, which is really fantastic. So to kick things off, we'll have Philip Graus. Philip has worked in architecture and urban design for over 35 years in Australia, the US and the UK. He was the director of Cox Architecture between 1992 and 2017, and then joined the Greater Sydney Commission in 2018 as director of Western Sydney City Deal, which involved planning and urban design of the Western Sydney Aerotropolis precincts, and more broadly working on the Western Parkland City. He's currently, as I said, very close, hopefully, to completing his PhD here at City Futures Research Centre, and is examining the role of urban design in metropolitan planning. And he's also a member of the Government Architect New South Wales State Design Review Panel. I'll also introduce Willem now. So Willem van Wyk is a registered planner, and he has experience in local government and also consultancy. He's a second year PhD candidate who's researching planning policy interpretation. He's also a casual academic helping with teaching here at UNSW and consults with his company WBW Planning. He recently updated the chapter on development in the most recent edition of the Environmental Law Handbook, published in 2024. He serves as the New South Wales State Editor and reporter for the Local Government Law Journal, Deputy Editor for the Environmental Law News, Practice Reviewer for the Australian Planner Journal, and is also on the editorial committee of New Planner. So plenty keeping him busy. And he also sits on the committee of the Environment and Planning Law Association. So we'll look forward to hearing from Willem in a moment, but we'll start off. Philip, if you'd like to come up. 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thanks for inviting me. I think I gave a talk here in 2022, which was really the beginning of the journey. And I'd like to acknowledge the commitment of Rob Freestone and Simon Pinniger, my supervisors. And I submitted my PhD 1 month ago today. So I look forward to questions, and I won't be incorporating them. So just to start with, why am I doing this? Why have I done this PhD? And why have I chosen this case study? So it's really been prompted by my practice experience, and probably just looking at these two images sort of tells the story. So on the left-hand side, you see this plan of Parramatta, which from a planning point of view looks fine. We've got the centres, we've got transport, all linked together. Then you go to Parramatta and you have a look at the physical design outcome. That transport has cut the city in half, it's bifurcated, and the physical design outcome does not match planning intent. Why? That is really my experience in practice. And I had a different experience then working with the Greater Sydney Commission, where we had a planning partnership, a city deal, a new plan and a new metropolitan authority. And we started to really link planning and urban design, which led me to start thinking about possible ways of looking at this differently. So from that, I sort of did this very crude sketch, being an architect, and hypothesising what the problems were. And on the left is what I call business as usual, where we have planning, which is macro, urban design considered micro, and really this gap between them. And I'm calling that business as usual. And my first observations in the GSC were we started to planning and urban design all scales at once, iteratively, and it suggested a better way of doing things. I was also very influenced by Richard Sennett, who's written a book called Building and Dwelling, and he called it really a planning urban design divide, and that really struck a chord. So from there, starting the PhD and working through rigorously with my supervisors, we took the hypothesis and framed it into an inquiry. And really, we started with 3 objectives. Firstly was understanding the influences of all these drivers beyond planning. And from my experience, it was those political, economic, all these other things that bore down on what one did. The second objective was to actually look at the interaction or the interface between planning and urban design. And from that really emerged the importance of governance as the enabler of the interface, which could be a good influence or a bad influence. And that interface is really about how design worked, which was very key to the case study. And the third objective was really to say, from that, what has been the role of urban design within that interface? And if we go to the right-hand side, the theoretical approaches that really stood out from a large amount of literature was this idea of Neil Brenner from Harvard. And he talked about these drivers as interscalar relationships. And what he was really saying is these drivers, whether they're economic or whatever, they're actually spatial and they're spatially related. It's really fundamental. And looking at the drivers, the 3 that really stood out was globalism, the rescaling up to global scale, climate change, which is also rescaling us from metropolitan to much more broadly, and the network of various actors who are now interrelated in everything we do. It's much less hierarchical, it's much more complex. And really, Brenner talks about these coming together. In terms of this interface, the 2 things again that stood out was Matthew Carmona from University College London, and he describes this interface through urban design as a place-making continuum, which meant the process had to be a continuum. It couldn't be of just a series going one way. And the other one was from Jonathan Barnett, the American urban designer, and he talked about the importance of big decisions being cognizant of the outcome. In other words, when that decision to draw that Parramatta plan was drawn, I would argue they were not cognizant of the physical design outcome. They knew what the planning intent was, but they weren't cognizant of what the place would be. And the last one, which was the role of urban design, and again comes from Barnett, and he defines urban design as providing physical design direction to city growth and change, which takes urban design, I think, to a scale well beyond talking about just designing the public domain, which is what most urban designers think they're doing, and I would argue is a very narrow interpretation. So from that, and I won't go through this in detail, but the hypothesis then was refined to bring in the idea of the drivers and also this idea of a continuum. I just talk briefly about the metropolis of 3 cities. And what's really important about this plan that's different is, I would argue that it's urban design infused. And what that means is it actually proposed a very powerful and compelling spatial reconceptualization of a city that was a core. And if you look at the 4 plans before that, we kept drawing global arcs and all this stuff going towards this western periphery, still emanating from the core. So to reconceptualize it as 3 cities, each with a globally significant centre, changed this whole idea of a periphery. And we now had 3 cities, each of them spatialised as harbour, river, parkland, etc. What was really important was they were economically and socially to be equal and distinct. But I'll focus on the Western Parkland city. And if you just look at the numbers under this plan, the Western Parkland city has half the rainfall. It has 7 times as many days above 35 degrees. And its canopy, while it's the west where it's all agricultural, actually has half the tree canopy of the eastern suburbs. So this idea of rebalancing the city was quite radical and spatially had a lot of implications. These are just drawings I've been preparing that try to understand the structure of the city. So when we look at the drawing on the right-hand side, the broader vision is spatialised. We can see the blue-green framework of Wianamanta Creek, the transport, the airport, Aerotropolis, as key elements of the diagram. On the left-hand side, I've tried to show the governance of how this would work, which had strengths and weaknesses which become obvious as one starts to analyse this. We have a region plan, which is that top square, which was developed by the Greater Sydney Commission. The district plans were also done by the Commission, and a thing called the Growth Infrastructure Compact on the left. So these different elements, and a lot of them were beyond business as usual. The idea of the Growth Infrastructure Compact, connect growth to infrastructure and not propose growth beyond infrastructure, which became very contentious, as probably most of you know. The Department of Planning, with the planning partnership, which came out of the city deal, was responsible for the new growth areas, including Aerotropolis and precinct plans. The South Creek corridor, which was spine and really the urban design defining element of the whole city, was then done by Infrastructure New South Wales Commission. So this is really illustrative of all the governance processes. What was interesting was the city deal and GSC really worked together. So in my role, I was part of the district plans, seconded to the planning partnership and city deal, which meant there was a connection across probably 80% of these, which was really unusual and provided opportunities to work iteratively and at all scales at once, which I'll show in another diagram. This diagram here was taken, developed out of just plotting all the projects that were being done. So a couple across the top, Metropolitan Co-Design, the GSC worked with all the various authorities at the whole city scale. That went over a long period. There was the blue-green framework and then a series of precinct plans. And what stood out when you plotted all of this, the area, it's three phases came out. The first one I've called Prelude, which was 2018. That set up the framework for what was to come. And the really unusual period was from 2019 to the middle of 2020. At that point, all plans were being worked on at once, which meant we worked across all of the scales from the whole city down to precincts, sets, working backwards and forwards. And the partnership was a studio where we had all of the disciplines. We had Metro, Transport for New South Wales, federal government, Department of Planning in one space for 2.5 years, working backwards and forwards, overlaying drawings, sketching backwards and forwards. And then there was a phase after that I call plan finalisation. That then went back to the much more statutory. So the first two, in a sense, were, I guess, beyond business as usual. They were novel, but to get things finalised and gazetted, went back to established frameworks. And one of the things that will come out is when you're trying to do something beyond business as usual through an established framework, that is where you have the real problem. And the reason you need business as usual, beyond business as usual, is because the world changes. Climate change has changed things, and it doesn't fit established frameworks, which we'll show you later. So what we did to try and explain this, and this is 3 roles that I think urban design had: communication, mediating, but importantly, shaping. Urban design is not just coordinating infrastructures, it has to be to an end. So we did these drawings to try and explain to people. So just very briefly, when we look at the top, that was green infrastructure. And a bit like the Parramatta thing on the left, starting with the big picture, zooming down in scale to try and say, if we draw this and we go down, here's the intent we want at the end. So we've got a square here, we don't have a highway through the middle of it, etc., etc. Then we go down to the drawings below and we show the hard infrastructure of transport. And again, going down in detail to show how that would work. And then we go up and down between. So it's almost a matrix, a scalar matrix, and then the overlaying of infrastructures, because we wanted to make sure there actually was a place at the end of it. And we also wanted to make sure the green infrastructure worked, which would basically cool the city. And those two things had to work backwards and forwards so that we could show the road people, as we go down in scale, you've now cut the creek in half or you haven't, can we please adjust this and that? And the only reason it worked, because we were sitting together, you built trust and relationships, and you could work iteratively, which was one of the highlights. But this is really just that period of all plans at once. And we developed a governance framework, which is phase 2. And this kind of shows the strengths and weaknesses. So the strength was there was a partnership, which is the centre of your drawing, where we had councils, Department of Planning, etc. And below that, we had the authorities and the designers working backwards and forwards. So while people were working on the South Creek plan, UNSW Sydney Water were working backwards and forwards. But in the workshops, we had Transport, Department of Planning. And then off, if I just go from the bottom square to the left, the really key intents from the metropolis of 3 cities were continuously backward and forward. So the metropolis of cities is unusual. There are urban design principles embedded in the plan. And so they work backwards and forwards, and a thing called urban typologies, where a precinct works environmentally rather than a land use. And then we also had a thing called wildlife attraction, because when you put an airport next to a parkland, there's birds flying everywhere, which was considered a huge problem between the levels of government, because the airport's federal, the rest was state. But because we had a planning partnership, we brought in ecologists and bird strike experts. We worked backwards and forwards to create a landscape strategy that would mean you wouldn't do species that would direct birds across. So by mediating, we actually mediated between the airport federal objectives and the state of getting the parkland city. But if we go back up, if we go to the left, we had to address the city deal commitments. But once those plans were made, you move to the right and you go through statutory planning. And so because the partnership had no legal right from a governance point of view, it was a client provider model. The client was the Department of Planning, and it was really up to them to take what they thought was appropriate or not appropriate. So this process bifurcated, which again became an issue as we went forward. And it's illustrated when you just take the plot the decisions. And this comes back to that question of decisions that are cognizant of outcomes. So a decision was made to do a thing called the land use plan, which is up the top there. It's called the LUIP. That was exhibited really early by the Department of Planning because they provide land use infrastructure and certainty for the landowner. What's it zoned? What can I do? That was exhibited, giving people an idea of what your land would be, how much developable area for the detailed planning commenced. So you kind of made a decision up front. You didn't know what the physical outcome was, and that would create real issues. So as we were designing all these other bits through 2019, came to a hard point in 2020, and this was to get development going. And one of the drivers was the airport had to open in 2026 and the metro had to be running. And if there's nothing to develop, very embarrassing for government. So you had to get developers G'd up very early on and meet their expectations. So in the middle of 2020, things were finalised to an extent where people could now lodge applications. And then the more detailed precinct planning was finalised later. And one of the issues was the more general drawings didn't show you the implications of the outcomes. So you'd have broad land use and all the rest of it. That all looked okay. We're going to get our stuff approved. When you start to do the detailed planning and you did the work for the blue-green framework, you had to work out how much permeable area to retain enough water to water trees, get transpiration, lower temperature. That's beyond business as usual, and it was not implicit in the early decisions made. They weren't cognizant of that outcome. And when it went on exhibition, there was a lot of opposition from landowners. And the landowners were very unhappy. Even though all this work had been done and there was engagement, they were not aware of the detailed outcomes, which was, I think, the problem. And the other issue, and while developers and landowners were blamed as being greedy and not giving up their land, etc., when you go back to the really early decisions, and this really came through in the interviews I did, when the city deal was done and they had the business case, and the blue-green infrastructure was the first soft infrastructure project approved by Infrastructure Australia. Business as usual said that, well, that'll basically be drainage, basins, business as usual. That land's never useful, so we won't need to acquire it. It's not useful. They made a decision all the way back not to fund land acquisition. They acquired whatever they needed for Metro, the airport, because that was business as usual. So this framework didn't allow, and there were no designers or people spatialising, doing the research, the work up front to make that decision. And that had enormous implications. And when sort of the what hit the fan, there was a community commissioner, and all they could use was established standards. So they said, well, how much open space do you need? Well, that's 400 metres from a house, etc., etc. We need drainage. So they reduced the overall open space by 38%. And on this drawing, the green is what was retained and the orange is everything that was removed from the plan. So the question remains is, has urban design improved the outcomes? I'll just go through this very briefly. We then had a roundtable at the end of my thesis and got a series of people, including the Planning Minister, Head of GSC, Parkland Authority, to test findings. What they found overall was the airport, the city deal, GSC, all of that was very positive in terms of outcomes. But there were the absent driver was champions. There was no one champion at each of the scales of the city deal, the metropolitan plan, the Acropolis plans. And that lack of a leader at the various scales of planning was seen as a fundamental problem. In terms of pathways forward, the main thing in terms of these drivers was that the government would have to focus on growth as the driver of infrastructure rather than individual projects. And that comes back to Barnett saying the role of urban design is to provide physical design direction to city growth and change. It comes back to that same governance question. The other thing that came out was this question of discretion. And I didn't pick that up. In my thesis, I looked at all these gaps and divides between governance. But what was pointed out was the lack of discretion. There's lots of discretion in strategic. As soon as you hit the statutory bit, there is no discretion. It goes to established rules, regulations. And that gap seems particular to here. I know we're talking about fiscal imbalances and all the rest of it, but this gap between the strategic and the statutory is very different to, say, the UK. There's a planning framework that mandates local government discretion, which means you can have a continuum. You can also introduce the right detail as needed, rather than us loading up all this detail up front, and the second half is just regulating it doesn't comply, doesn't. So the question coming back to, has urban design improved the outcome? I'll just show you this one plan. On the left here is the vision. On the right, while, as I said, 43% got taken out, because the process took open space, water cycle management, which was technical, biodiversity was technical, when we integrate and put them together, the plan on the right still creates a plan that's far more integrated than business as usual. So while there was a lot of compromise, I think the role of working backwards and forwards in that critical period has still translated through to the outcome. And this has just come out. This was a Land Environment Court ruling in the last month or so. This proposal was refused because it didn't actually meet the landscape-led approach. And there is enough of the urban design in the documents to say that blue-green structure in the urban structure was required, blue-green infrastructure, public domain, and Aboriginal culture and heritage. So through this process, there has certainly been an outcome, I think, that's an improvement. And if we've just, this is where we are now, this is what's built today. And what's interesting, while we've got the airport, the metro, and all the things you'd expect, one of the first things is the South Creek Advanced Recycling Centre, and that will connect tree canopy, natural drainage channels, regional stormwater and storage. In a sense, that brings us back to Weirmatta being central to the aspirational Woolling Green parkland vision. So that is really where this has come to. Whether that continues on, I think, remains an open question. Thank you.
Well, those questions for the end of an opportunity to ask both speakers.
So I'm looking at the interpretation of planning policy documents. These are non-statutory documents used in the assessment of development applications. I'm particularly looking at New South Wales, but hopefully there'll be implications across the country. My supervisors are Associate Professor Laura Cromlin and Professor Simon Pinniger. And I'm only in my second year, so I don't have too many primary research findings to share with you. Today will be a little bit more conceptual, but hopefully it will still be thought-provoking. So these are the types of policies I'm talking about. Yeah, so some of these are from the state government, such as the Apartment Design Guide, many of you would know, the Childcare Centre Planning Guideline. Others are from state agencies, such as the Rural Fire Service in the middle at the bottom there, and then others are from local government. Some of the local government ones are mandatory, so every local government has to have a development control plan, a DCP, whereas others are optional, a little bit more informal, a bit more ad hoc, such as this interim floodplain lands policy of sort of council. Increasingly, these type of documents are being relied upon for environmental governance. There's any number of reasons for that. One of those is that it bypasses the formality of statute, doesn't have to go through Parliament. It's a bit easier to update, can be a bit of a live document. It can also be written in a more flexible way. So these are written to communicate to lay actors in the planning system, mums and dads, if you will. They often have more general language, pictures, diagrams, even just from the cover pages, you can see it. It looks different to law. They're often written by planners, but all of that doesn't mean that they aren't scrutinised. So in New South Wales, if council refuses your DA or takes too long to determine it, you can take it to the Land Environment Court. And those cases can often turn on the interpretation of these documents. This will be pretty obvious to a lot of you, but this is just a general framework of planning. I would call it regulatory planning documents. I don't really like the statutory strategic distinction, but I guess it is statutory planning used in development assessment. The umbrella legislation is the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. Then we've got SEP, State Environmental Planning Policy, and Local Environmental Plans, LEPs. The SEPs and the LEPs, they are still statute. They're what's called an Environmental Planning Instrument, an EPI. My research is really focusing on everything below the dotted line, those non-statutory policy, whether from the state or from local government. So one key difference is that the laws go through the Parliamentary Council's office, while everything below the dotted line does not. At the state level, it's just a state department. At a local government level, it's usually the final decisions made by the local councillors, but not necessarily. It can also just be done internally. And similarly, at local government level, sometimes an in-house lawyer, council would have a look at the policy and its drafting, but again, not necessarily. So there's a bit more of a variation in the quality of drafting. I won't detail each of these. This is what I see as the 5 steps of assessing each DCP control. I'm really just putting it here to show that it's a distinction between interpretation and application. So the interpretation is what is the control, how do we actually read it? And then the application is how rigidly we apply it. So the EPNA Act already requires DCPs to be flexibly applied. For example, where there'd be a better planning outcome from allowing a variation to the site setback. But I'm looking at that initial step of interpretation. And I guess building on what Philip has been saying about discretion, in my opinion, the discretion should really be happening at the application level. That's where we need to allow planners to be planners to make good planning decisions. But what actually is the law? There we need, or the policy, we need consistency. It's got to be clear what we're actually applying. Then there is these principles of statutory interpretation. These have been developed over hundreds of years in common law. They're seen as a juristic code of communication. They're sort of rules of thumb or ways people read law, commonly accepted process. And laws are drafted in light of these. A lot of these are quite common sense. One example would be that the more specific overrides the more general. There is a Latin phrase for it, but I won't go there. If residential flat buildings are prohibited across an entire medium density residential zone, but then there's another provision that says, well, in this particular street they are permissible, then that more specific provision would override. I think the reasoning is that someone's actually put direct thought into that street, and so it makes sense that that trumps, gets priority. But the one that really was the genesis for this project is this one, that the consistent use of words carry consistent meaning. And it's obvious, if you're using 2 different words, the assumption is you're meaning 2 different things. And for my sins, I previously worked in local government at Strathfield Council, and there we had a DCP. It says there was adopted in 2020, but really it was just repackaged. It was probably drafted around the turn of the century. It only applies to two allotments. But one of those allotments just happened to be a DA, and then it went to court. And the DTP talks about adjacent development, and a few pages later talks about adjoining development. And when we got to court, the lawyers are really keen to distinguish the 2 things. 2 different words must mean 2 different things. I just thought to myself, the planner that drafted this back in the day probably was not thinking about this at all, like that level of precision. If they had put their mind to it, they probably were just using synonyms because that's what we do in everyday language, just to like keep it interesting. But I also think more fundamentally, it shows a different way of thinking. For the lawyer, the emphasis here is what is the outer extent of this word? What is its semantic range? Exactly how many properties down the road? Where's the line? Whereas for the planner, it's a bit more about the impact. So it's especially the direct neighbour where the impacts are likely to be most pronounced, and then a little bit less further down the street. It's about the core meaning of the word. So in a nutshell, I'm looking at whether these established principles of statutory interpretation should be carried across into non-statutory policy. And if that's the case, there is an education piece to be had. planners must be aware of it. Whether they like it or not, whether it's their intention or not, this is the interpretive lens that's going to be applied over the top to their policy documents. But if it's not fit for purpose, well, then we need a viable alternative. And what else is there? So you might ask why this matters, particularly if we're anyway going to be flexibly applying down the track. But we first need to know what it is that we are flexibly applying. We need to know what it means. And this can have significant implications. So, I mean, these days it can cost upwards of $100,000 to lodge a DA for a dwelling by the time you get architectural drawings and consultant reports and lodgement fees. So there's a fairness element in people actually knowing what controls are going to be applied to their site, how council's going to read it, whether they comply with the site setback or not. Part of that is market certainty as well, particularly in a housing crisis. This is one of those areas where we maybe don't need discretion. And it can have significant implications. So it can affect the pathway of the development. So, for example, the childcare planning guideline, it defines unencumbered indoor and outdoor play areas for childcare centres. Depending on how you read that and how rigidly you interpret those provisions, could be whether you comply or not, and therefore whether it has to go to the department as concurrence or not. And if you get that wrong, it potentially is open to judicial review. So there can be a lot at stake. But I also think more fundamentally, it is about preserving the planning intent of these documents. These are planners' documents. And so how do we make sure that the planning knowledge in them is not hollowed out once we get into a legal space? So as I said, often these things end up in court and they sort of have that final role in interpretation. So there's a lot of power there. And that sort of does also go to the separation of powers. And do the judiciary really have the final say in interpretation of non-legal documents? And what's the role of the executive in that? And finally, AI. So that's obviously a big buzzword in planning at the moment. All these efficiency improvements that are going to be coming in development assessment. That's only going to be as good as the interpretive inputs that we give the AI. So if the AI is going to be automatically assessing the DA, we need to be really clear on what those controls mean that it's meant to be assessing. So in terms of my objectives, I'm going to start by looking at existing approaches in New South Wales. It's quite a nascent space. There's not a lot of thought being given to this area. Although I would say that there has been some helpful analogous case law and other types of documents. So for example, conditions of development consent. They are also drafted by planners and not lawyers. Even if the end product does form a legal document, there's quite a bit more case law about how to interpret them. And then interstate approaches. I do think New South Wales is a bit the high watermark of legalism in planning. We have the Land and Environment Court, the only other jurisdiction in the nation to have something similar is South Australia. So other than those, it's tribunals. But nevertheless, even in those tribunals, they have brought this up as an issue without really resolving it. And finally, I'll just try and improve the situation or at least raise awareness of it. In terms of the conceptual framework, so I think one of the reasons this hasn't really been studied all that much is because it does sit at the edge of a few different disciplines. But these are really the key categories that I frame my research around. The first is planning epistemology. If we want to be protecting planning knowledge in a legal space, we need to know what that planning knowledge is. Unfortunately, as a lot of you can imagine, it is quite hard to pin down. But some initial thoughts that I have is that we tend to use vaguer words, things like the public interest, which are hard to pin down and deliberately aren't defined because any attempt to demarcate it arbitrarily limits its breadth. That doesn't mean it's meaningless. It just means that its fringes are a bit fuzzy. It still has a core meaning, but then exactly where its edge is a level of generality that's a little bit unfamiliar in law. So amenity is another example. Been defined as you know it when you lose it. And another thought here is that pragmatism prevails in planning that maybe doesn't in law. It's not necessarily just about precision and process, it's actually about an outcome on the ground. Interpretive theory is something where there has been a lot of work done across various disciplines. So in hermeneutics, for example, in literary theory, the role of the author compared to the reader. Surprisingly, there's a lot of theory about principles as well, and particularly in the law space. A lot of that theory actually mirrors policy. So just like a principle is more flexible than a rule, so a policy is more flexible than a law. And finally, there's this trajectory of statutory interpretive. Starting with the literal approach, the dictionary definition of individual words. Quickly, it was realized that that's probably not the best way to go about it because meaning is derived from the context of those words. So then we get to this purposive approach. It sort of more focuses on text, context, and purpose, where purpose is the mischief that the legislation is trying to remedy. And finally, since the 90s, in a case called CIC Insurance and Bankstown Football Club, we have the modern approach to statutory interpretation. It's probably more of a subset of the purposive approach. It doesn't change it too much. But some of the key distinctions or nuance changes are that it talks about use of the language of legislative intention rather than purpose. And it gives a renewed role for context. Context is to be considered in the first instance and to the widest possible extent. It's not only to be used where there's a tiebreaker between two other competing definitions or interpretations. And I think what I really want to argue is that that context has to incorporate the author's context, the planning author. Even if it's being interpreted in a legal space, we have to consider the thought world, the interpretive horizon of the planner. And if the planner wasn't conceiving of a distinction between adjoining and adjacent, then to arbitrarily impose that afterwards is a misinterpretation. So this trajectory, I suppose, sort of sits over the top of the principles of statutory interpretation. And finally, there are some cross-disciplinary approaches. So legal geography in particular, it's probably 2 decades ahead of planning in thinking about how their discipline gets translated into law. There are some differences. Planning is a little bit more anthropocentric, probably a little bit less polycentric. But still, there is a lot that we can learn from the attempts of geographers and environmental scientists to actually preserve their professional knowledge once it gets to court. And they face a lot of similar issues. So the legal geographers lament that geographers also don't really seem to have a particular interest in the law. Maybe they see it as abstracted from society or too difficult to dabble in. But ultimately, the law is not just reflecting society, it is acting upon society. Lawmaking is world making. It's city shaping. Like where we draw the lines has an impact on the built environment. And so planners should care about the law. And yet, obviously, there are tensions between planning and law, and I think we really see that in property and planning law. So property law is defensive. It's trying to protect and preserve, whereas planning law is trying to promote and facilitate. So very different ideologies, and yet the two have managed to coexist over the last 100 years or so. So I think there are learnings from that can be applied to policy interpretation in terms of planning knowledge still being able to coexist within a legal realm when it gets to court. And finally, the reasonable man, just whether there is that sort of singular idealistic interpretation, that objective rational perspective. And I'm particularly looking at feminist critiques of that, multicultural city. In terms of my methodology, starting with the legal analysis, so that's what I'm currently busy working on. The source case is one called Gill and Donald Humberston from the 1960s in the UK. And that was a scaffolding regulation case where the judge said there might be inconsistencies in this regulation. It doesn't have the precision of a lot of other laws, but it's there for a practical purpose. It's there to be used. It's a doing document. And so that's been carried across into New South Wales. This case from the UK was before the Australia Acts. It's being carried across in a slightly ad hoc way. I describe it as statutory interpretation, the normal principles of statutory interpretation plus this more flexible, practical interchangeability of words, looseness of expression, like an extra principle really to statutory interpretation. But more recently, the Chief Judge has sort of poured cold water on that idea in a case called J.K. Williams and Sydney Water Corporation, where he said really that there is nothing but statutory interpretation. So yeah, that's where we are at the moment. And then I will speak to, well, I'm currently busy doing my ethics, so trying to speak to some judges, some barristers, commissioners, planners, of course, and academics. Anyone here wants to have a chat, please do. And finally, just an applied review of the principles. So looking at some particularly difficult passages in various policy documents and considering how different interpretive lenses would impact the meaning from them. That's it. Thank you. So we'll do the questions together. For either Philip or myself.
We don't have any questions online, so anyone in the room, if they have questions, please go ahead.
I have one question from you. Something you mentioned from in the very beginning slides was that you mentioned that the tree canopy of the western areas in Sydney are a bit less than eastern area.
Yes.
I was a little bit surprised by that because I was like just intuitively thinking that the western areas are covered more with vegetation compared to the.
Yeah, I think that's the importance of the survey. But one of the critiques of these three cities is we should just keep densifying the east and leave the west as a parkland agriculture. The reality is people have been in the western periphery for over 100 years. Lots of agriculture basically is the land. And a guy called Mark from Tyrrell Studio who started the Green Grid, written a great paper called Hidden Grids. Basically, and one of the big potentials of the Western Parkland City is we develop so quickly, we spread, and we like flat. So whatever's flat, you get rid of stuff, you grow. Anything that's a gully or difficult, just leave it, keep going. But it's all those gullies, which is where the tree canopy is now. So when you look at the Wianamata Creek tributary system, it's about, so the Western Parkland City is 80,000 hectares. The creek might be about 12%. That's actually the framework of where the canopy still is, but that's 12%. And as you saw in the east suburbs at 22%. So the reality of the Western Parkland City is it's basically not a natural landscape that was there in times when it was basically the homeland of Aboriginal people. So what this is talking about is a reconstructed landscape, and it raises interesting questions about country. And we did a lot of work with country. If we just use Indigenous canopy, it survives drought. It's great. It survives drought by closing up, and on a hot day, it won't transpire. It'll be hotter than no trees. So we have to bring water in to water canopy to deal with climate change. So it's a changed landscape, and it raises questions about country, which always responded to change. And so again, established ticker box, country tick, tick, just won't work. And it's another example of when you need change, established governance frameworks don't address change. And it's one of the big problems. But also, people have this impression of what places are that's totally inaccurate. In Western Sydney on a really hot day,
when you look at mortality, twice as many people in Western Sydney and Penrith will die as the east. So the east is actually, it has the canopy, it has many of the things that these other areas don't have, which is where the whole rebalancing vision came out of.
We have a question from Brenda Frugal, for Willem, I guess. You mentioned that words such as amenity could be lost through legal interpretation, which is concerning. What has your research shown to be alternative language?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, some of these terms are already in statute, so I'm wary of just saying that these are a function of policy. So often in objectives when in LEPs, there is the word amenity used. I think one way in which it has been dealt with is by breaking down the word. So rather than using amenity, they would break it down into hours of solar access, for example, and then it's a little bit more objective. There's a more straight line around the definition, which I think is what sort of a legal way of thinking and putting things in boxes refers. So it's the same with character. Do we just break it down into roof pitch angles? But if we do that, I think we still lose something. And I'm sure Philip would have views on urban design. I actually think, yeah, it is helpful to think about constituent parts to these words, but ultimately they're thick concepts, and trying to reduce them into subcategories, often you do lose something along the way. And so the preference for planners is to keep the thick word intact.
Yeah, Willem, you mentioned that the principles of statutory interpretation have changed over time. Given we're sort of on the modern interpretation at the moment, do you think there could be scope for perhaps a post-modern one that could maybe apply to these non-statutory documents, or where in your research do you sort of see that going?
Yeah, there is some legal theorists that believe we are now in a post-modern interpretive scheme, but especially in Australia, there's so few applications, particularly in the High Court, that these type of big theories are now being based on how do you read one or two sentences of High Court judgments. So I don't think there's enough evidence yet to say we are post the modern approach. Interestingly, what they have been talking about is very similar to postmodernism in legal theory, so that the law can actually change its meaning as it goes. So it's not that originalist. You know, if we say legislative intention, that means their intention at the time that they wrote it, which technology changes, and so the ways that law has to apply include things that the original legislators didn't conceive of, really. I'm not sure whether the further trajectory of statutory interpretation necessarily helps policy interpretation. I think it's worth taking a step back and going, well, they're two very different types of documents, written by different people for different purposes. So yeah, even the idea of statutory interpretation plus this more flexible interpretation, I'm not convinced by that yet. Yes.
How do they differ from performance-based requirements like in the BCA, in Code of Australia?
Yeah, it's a good question.
In terms of flexibility.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that they're not different in their interpretation. And then in the application, the BCA's got the deemed provisions, or deemed to comply provisions. And I'd say that's quite similar to flexibly applying your DCP. In terms of how you actually read it, I think that we could include BCA as part of policy in that it's not quite written like a statute. But yeah, at least in the Land Environment Court, I haven't seen too many cases actually turn on BCA interpretations. So I think that sort of comes later, and a lot of that No one really checks up on it. Like if I read the BCA slightly different to someone else, that's not likely to make it to court in the same way that when the DA is still with council and there's a different interpretation.
The BCA also has its guideline documents as well, which are more flexible.
Yeah.
Well, not mandatory.
Yeah, and so I think it's helpful thinking of the concept of soft law, and I think there's a spectrum. It's not just hard law and soft law. And the softer you get, I think the more flexible you should be in your interpretation.
Sort of a question for both of you, and either of you can jump in, but it feels like there's an element in the argument that both of you are making that's really around how well or not well does our system recognise expertise and different kinds of expertise. So, the sort of argument that the planners, have an expertise, but that gets kind of smushed out as it gets more further through the legal process. And similarly, the design sort of expertise that then the very formalised planning stages doesn't have the capacity to actually incorporate that or recognise that. Does that ring true to you, or is it more?
I think what's been found is a really interesting thing called Urban Maestro, where UCL and the United Nations looked at 100 cities in Europe, and they said, where have we got good outcomes? And let's go back to, then we'll look at the governance, see what the link is. And what we've been talking about is soft power and hard power in a sense. And what they found is when you apply either one in isolation, it's generally a failure. So hard and soft have to be one system. The example I guess you could use is, say, the City of Sydney competition policy. So you start with a brief. So you engage in a soft power way the developer in the city. There's a commercial brief, a design brief, planning brief. You then have a design competition, which is called soft power, all that stuff. There's hard power running through it. Why do they go through all this? You get 10% more height or floor space, hard power. But there's another one, and that is you go through the process, you get all these architects on the jury, oh, that's the best one, blah, blah, blah. The city then has the hard power to say, yes, it's achieved design excellence, or no, it hasn't. Has a huge impact, because if that wasn't there, just get 3 very compliant architects who does whatever the developer wants. Well, that's great. You do all that, the jury goes, well, that one's best. City goes, didn't achieve design excellence. You just spent $1 million on your competition, and guess what? You're not getting your floor space. That hard power makes you take the soft power seriously. If you don't integrate them, you will not get the outcome. So the LEP, DCP, state, local, if they're not part of one system, and this is the governance question, and I think it's more important than having a metropolitan planning authority or more authorities, it's really this integration, and that needs regulatory and you need discretion. If they're not both there, the outcome is worse, and that seems to be in the overseas research. And I think in the case study, there were instances of the two together, but it is not throughout our governance, from what I've seen.
Yeah, I would just add that we should have confidence in our profession. I think part of the issue is that, we still can't decide what planning is. Anyone can say they're a planner on their door. Are we really a profession? I definitely think in the Land Environment Court, it's the lawyers that get paid more. And that says something about who's valuable in that space.
Is there a difference between town planning and urban planning?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and I think we are too quick to just look up to these other professions. Maybe they are more prestigious, but we should go into these spaces confident. If we're the expert witness in a court case, well, we're bringing something to that. We should have confidence.
I think there's no more questions. Thank you both, Willem and Willem, and we wish you good luck for the rest of your PhD. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Just a quick reminder that our next seminar will be held in 2 weeks. We're looking forward to hear from Dr. Mike Harris, who presents macromobility, community and policy in Sydney. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a great afternoon.